That night, 500 German bombers crossed the channel, guided by an invisible line, and a 28-year-old physicist, alone in an office, managed to see it. London, winter of 1939. Inside a narrow office at the Air Ministry, a young man with restless eyes twirled a pencil between his fingers as if trying to solve a riddle. His name? Reginald Victor Jones, 28 years old, a physicist and newly recruited for a war that would not be fought with bullets, but with invisible waves. Before him, a stack of messages intercepted by British intelligence, full of strange terms: Knickebein, X-Gerät, beams. Words that seemed like nonsense, but to Jones sounded like codes from a meticulously calculated plan. While the generals slept believing the war was won with tanks and grenades, Jones saw something more: a war fought in the air and in the ether. In the early hours, he noticed a pattern. German radio transmissions appeared just before the bombings, as if enemy planes were being guided along an invisible route, traced from waves no one could see. What if there were a path in the air, a radio track leading each bomber straight to the heart of England, he thought. The hypothesis was bold, even absurd. When he presented the idea to his superiors, he was met with laughter. Radio beams guiding planes? That's science fiction, doctor. But what sounded like madness would, in fact, be the start of the most ingenious turning point of World War II. For 3 nights, Jones reviewed reports, interceptions, and coordinates that no one could decipher. With each scribbled sheet, doubt grew, and so did fear. Then he took a map of Europe, drew lines from German stations, and noticed something impossible to ignore. The intersections fell exactly over the bombed targets. It wasn't coincidence. It was geometry applied to destruction. Jones set the pencil on the table, looked at the map, and murmured, "They're aiming with light you can't see." A phrase no one in the army would understand, but one that would change the course of the war. Days later, in a room full of generals, Jones presented his discovery. The uniforms gleamed, so did the skepticism. He drew on the board. 2 transmitters create radio beams that cross over a city. When a bomber crosses both, it knows it's on target, even under clouds, darkness, or smoke. Silence. Then a muffled laugh. Radio beams crossing the English Channel? That's witchcraft, doctor. But the physicist didn't back down. He knew that if he was right, the Luftwaffe possessed an invisible weapon, and no one was prepared to fight it. That same night, Jones returned to his small office. He spread diagrams, notes, and fragments of downed aircraft parts across the table. Everything pointed to an inescapable conclusion. The Germans had turned the airspace into a web of precision, and every line in that web was drawn in silence. Then an interrogation report fell into his hands. A captured German pilot had mentioned beam training before abruptly falling silent. The confirmation Jones needed. He called his assistant, Charles Frank. "Come to the office now. I think I've found their map." 2 hours later, the two were staring at a pile of graphs. "They're flying over a line of sound," Jones said. "And when they cross another, they know they're at the exact spot." Frank fell silent. "That's brilliant and terrifying." Outside, the wind blew cold over a London that slept unaware that its survival depended on a physicist labeled a lunatic. But proving his theory required more than logic. It required capturing the invisible. Jones requested authorization to equip planes with special receivers, hunting these supposed beams over British skies. For nights, they flew over the channel, searching for signals no one could see. Nothing, not a sound. The superiors mocked. "Our physicist is chasing ghosts." But on the 4th night, the impossible happened. A thin, steady, persistent trace appeared on the oscilloscope. It came from the continent. Following it, the plane arrived exactly over a factory, the kind of target the Luftwaffe would choose. The silence in the cockpit was absolute. The pilot looked at Jones and simply nodded. The physicist fixed his eyes on the oscilloscope and whispered, "So it's real." In that moment, the invisible war began. Back at base, he ran through the corridors with the papers in hand, like someone carrying a bomb about to explode. "They're guiding the bombers with radio. I can prove it." And he did. The measurements, the angles, the pulses, everything matched. The beam's coordinates coincided with the exact point of the last attack on Birmingham. The Air Ministry finally began to listen. And with that, a new weapon was born: scientific intelligence. But Jones knew detection wasn't enough. It was necessary to deceive. If the enemy used beams to aim, he would create false beams to make them miss. The idea seemed so risky that even his own assistant doubted it. "You want to fool the Luftwaffe with radio lies?" Jones smiled. "Lies that save lives." As winter grew darker, he assembled his small team: radio technicians, engineers, and field operators. They worked in freezing hangars, testing antennas, building receivers, and tuning transmissions. Amid sleepless nights and cold coffee, the first prototype emerged of what would change the war: beam countermeasures, known as mechaning. It was the dawn of a new era, a war fought in the invisible, between sound and silence, between precision and deception. Jones, the mad physicist, had just opened a new battlefront where the weapon was not steel, but intelligence. The hangar where Jones worked had no flags, no anthems, no glory of battles. It was cold, damp, full of cables scattered on the floor, and radios hissing like nervous hearts. There, sound was everything, and silence an enemy. The men in that room didn't fly planes or wield weapons. They hunted frequencies. Jones walked between the tables, observing improvised antennas and meters pulsing like beacons from another world. He knew that if he could interfere with the German beams without being detected, he could blind the Luftwaffe without firing a single shot. The idea seemed simple on paper: capture the enemy's signal, mimic it, and transmit it back with small distortions. Enough to trick a bomber into dropping its load in the wrong place. But in practice, every hertz was a minefield. "We can't just block," Jones said. "If we block, they'll notice. We need to make them believe they're right when they're wrong." It was a war of illusions, and the enemy didn't even know it had begun. The technical term emerged in a low voice, like a secret code: mechaning. The first antennas were erected discreetly in South England, modest towers hidden among barns and hills. By day, they looked like part of the rural landscape. At night, they became sentinels of the ether. The operators, young men hastily trained, monitored the air with headphones on and eyes fixed on oscilloscopes. A steady trace meant danger, continuous noise, hope. In one of those early mornings, the silence was broken by a high-pitched tone. Jones approached the panel and murmured, "He's there." The German beam, thin as a razor, crossed the English Channel. The British had just found the invisible trail guiding death. In the following days, Jones and his team began tests. They adjusted the frequency, modulated the signal, and transmitted back a slightly shifted tone. The effect was subtle, almost imperceptible. But on the other side, in German cockpits, the instruments began to lie. The sound that should indicate "on target" now echoed kilometers before the real point. The pilots trusted the machines blindly, and that's how the Luftwaffe's first precision bombing completely missed its target. The bombs fell on empty fields, and for the first time since the war began, London breathed a little easier. Jones didn't celebrate. He knew that if the Germans discovered it, they would change the entire system. "The secret is disguise," he said. "They need to believe we're incompetent." And so, while the generals discussed maps and statistics, he waged a war of silence, made of equations, timing, and courage. But every small victory brought a new dilemma. If British authorities showed too much relief, if they evacuated cities or reinforced defenses en masse, the Germans would notice the mistake. That's why many attacks were deliberately not intercepted, only diverted. It was cruel but necessary. Jones knew his interference saved lives, but also allowed controlled losses, all to preserve the secret. Sometimes he stared at civilian casualty reports with empty eyes and simply murmured, "The truth can't leak," or "they'll learn." The team's morale fluctuated between pride and guilt. The operators slept in short shifts, waking at the slightest radio noise. The generals, who once called him a lunatic, now requested daily reports. "Dr. Jones, what's the range of our antennas? Can we protect Coventry?" The word Coventry froze the air in the room. The city was one of England's main industrial centers, and interception signals indicated it would be the next target. Jones gathered his group. He spread maps on the table and showed the calculations. "They'll attack in 4 days. We know the beam's path, the flight time, and the precision. We can create a diversion, but not a total one. If we shift too much, they'll notice. If we shift too little, Coventry will be reduced to ashes." Silence. One of the technicians asked what they would do. Jones replied with an almost painful calm, "We'll do enough to make them miss, but not enough to make them suspect." When Churchill received the report, he was torn. The Prime Minister knew that fully protecting Coventry would give away the decoding secret. "How many lives will it cost to keep the secret?" he asked. Jones replied without emotion, "Maybe hundreds, but it will save thousands in the coming weeks." The decision was made in silence. On the night of November 14, 1940, the sky roared. Over 500 Luftwaffe bombers crossed the channel. Jones' transmitters were activated. Invisible antennas sang perfect lies. Many planes missed the mark, dumping bombs on open fields and rivers. But dozens of others hit the heart of Coventry. The city burned. The flames could be seen 30 kilometers away. As the fire devoured homes and factories, Jones stayed at his post, staring at the oscilloscope. The signal trembled as if it felt pain too. "It worked," he said almost inaudibly, "but at what cost?" The next day, the newspapers reported the massacre. No one knew that on that same night, England had fought the first electronic battle in human history and won. Coventry was partially destroyed, but the secret remained. The Luftwaffe, confident, continued using the same system. And Jones, even exhausted, knew. The true invisible war was just beginning. The attack on Coventry left scars in stone and conscience. But while the ashes still smoldered, Reginald Jones was already working. He knew the Luftwaffe wouldn't stop, and that to win, they would have to evolve faster than the enemy. Inside a laboratory hidden under absolute secrecy, he began building what he called a machine of lies, a system of antennas and transmitters capable of speaking to the Germans in their own language and deceiving them in their own electronic idiom. The Germans, proud of their precision, had developed a new system, the X-Gerät. It was a more sophisticated method, using multiple beams in sequence, encoding the exact moments to start the countdown and drop the bombs. A second's error could mean kilometers of difference, and Jones knew that was his opening. "They've turned the sky into a clock," he said, pointing to graphs. "So let's delay the clock." The team worked without rest. The laboratory walls vibrated with the continuous sound of generators and the hum of experimental transmitters. Every frequency adjustment was an attempt to speak to the enemy without being noticed. The plan was to create false signals, phantom responses that seemed legitimate but distorted the countdown time. It was like teaching the echo to lie. If it worked, Luftwaffe pilots would believe they were over the target when in fact they were flying over empty fields. Robert Watson Watt, the British radar pioneer, joined the operation. He and Jones formed a curious contrast, a pragmatic engineer and a visionary physicist. Together, they designed antenna arrays capable of shaping waves like invisible sculptures. Every lobe, every interference was a calculated blow. We don't need to destroy the beam, we need to make it doubt itself. It was science applied to military psychology. In the first real test, hands trembled. The night was cloudy, and a German bomber approached a coastal city. The British operator adjusted the transmitter and waited for the right tone. Suddenly, the false beam was activated. The noise on the oscilloscope changed pattern, a small jump, almost imperceptible. On the other side, the German pilot believed he was perfectly aligned. He dropped the bombs. They fell into the sea. The city remained untouched. The British radio buzzed in tense silence. Jones simply whispered, "Well-told lie." The news spread among the small circle of scientists, but remained secret beyond it. The public would never know that on that night, Great Britain had won a battle with waves. High Command sent only a note, "Enemy precision declining. Continue." Jones smiled with exhaustion. The war was now his. But the enemy didn't sleep. Soon, intercepted messages revealed something new. Mentions of a system called Wotan, named after the Germanic mythology god with one eye. To Jones, it sounded like a taunt. He said, "If Wotan sees everything, we'll make him see what doesn't exist." Wotan was different, a bidirectional beam, capable of sending and receiving signals, a true electronic dialogue between ground and plane. The German system calculated distance based on the time the echo took to return. It was a dangerous advance because it allowed the bomber to know exactly where it was. Crude interference would be suicide. Any distortion would give away the trick. The solution? Create perfectly timed false echoes, fake responses that seemed natural but fooled the enemy's calculation. Jones called it masking beacons. British radio towers would respond to German signals with tiny time lies, altering the echo by thousands of a second. That was enough to divert the bomber kilometers off target. The genius was in the detail. The error seemed human. No one in the Luftwaffe would suspect sabotage. The first test occurred on a cold December night. A bomber approached southern England. British operators heard the interrogation signal, the eye of Wotan blinking in the dark. At the right moment, Jones authorized "respond." An invisible pulse traveled through the sky. The enemy believed it was over the target. It dropped the bombs. They fell into the sea. When the reports arrived, German High Command recorded the incident as a technical anomaly. It was the perfect victory, silent, invisible, and undeniable. But with each success, the weight grew. Jones began to feel the cost of fighting in the invisible. He slept little, ate less. Sometimes he stared at the oscilloscope like someone facing a mirror. "How many lies are needed to tell the truth?" he once asked Charles Frank. The assistant replied, "The ones that save." That winter, the masking beacons multiplied. England turned the ether into a wall, and the physicist labeled mad had become the commander of a war no one saw. It was the triumph of mind over force, and for the first time the Luftwaffe began to doubt itself. The winter of 1941 turned England's skies into a silent battlefield. No civilian could see what happened above the clouds, but Jones knew every noise, every radio pulse was an invisible shot. The masking beacon stations multiplied like underground routes. In barns, coastal lighthouses, and disguised towers, operators kept the transmitters active night after night, responding to Luftwaffe beams with precise, lying echoes. The sound of the planes was the same, but their electronic eyes were blind. With each frustrated mission, German High Command recorded failures, deviations, and unexplained human errors. Pilots were punished, engineers replaced, and no one suspected the real enemy was a solitary mind operating in the dark. A Luftwaffe report said, "Our bombers have lost their instinct. Precision has vanished." It was the echo of Jones' success. He had achieved something the generals deemed impossible, winning with silence. While the British public still lived under sirens and air raid shelters, Jones waged a war of patience and calculation. His office had become a sanctuary of wires and formulas. Maps covered the walls. The floor was a graveyard of papers. Amid the chaos, he saw beauty. "Every line here is a choice of life or death," he said, pointing to diagrams scribbled with a pencil tip. What began as scientific curiosity was now a duel of minds, and the young physicist had become the Luftwaffe's most feared ghost. But victory brought risks. A British newspaper published a note hinting that new blocking technologies were protecting cities. Jones froze when he read it. That headline, if it reached the Germans, could ruin 2 years of work. He went personally to the editor, accompanied by Secret Service agents. "You've just put thousands of lives at risk with one sentence," he said firmly, staring the man in the eyes. Censorship was imposed immediately. Fortunately, the Germans dismissed the article as propaganda. The secret was safe, by a hair. Even with growing success, Jones didn't let himself get drunk on it. He knew every advance would provoke a reaction, and it came in the form of a new coding system. Intercepted transmissions began mentioning something different: long-range experiments, controlled launches, and a name no one knew yet: Peenemünde. Peenemünde. That name sounded strange, almost harmless, but carried a weight Jones felt immediately. It appeared in technical reports, transport logs, and falsified weather messages. He noticed a pattern: night trains coming and going, prohibited reconnaissance flights in the area, and absolute silence around the site. All of it indicated the Germans were building something new, something that didn't need a pilot. "They're preparing a weapon that doesn't come back," he told his superiors. The general replied with a skeptical smile. "Rockets, Doctor? That's H.G. Wells fiction." Jones simply responded, "Then we'd better start reading fiction as science." He cross-referenced interception data, train routes, and European resistance information. The picture began to form. Unusually proportioned metal cylinders, large fuel tanks, and test laboratories. The words launch, liquid propulsion, and extended range appeared repeatedly. It was the harbinger of the V-2 ballistic rockets, weapons capable of crossing the sky in minutes and hitting London before anyone could react. When he took the report to Churchill, the Prime Minister fell silent. Aerial photographs showed something impossible: circular platforms, long shadows, cylindrical tanks. "They're rocket silos," Jones explained, "and they're aimed at us." The meeting ended without applause, without speeches. Just the order: "Find out everything you can, Doctor, and fast." The mission was codenamed Operation Hydra. Over 600 RAF bombers would take off in a single night to destroy the Peenemünde complex. Jones' mind was now at stake. If he was wrong, hundreds would die in vain. If he was right, he could delay the future of destruction. In the early hours of August 17, 1943, engines roared in England's skies. Jones watched the maps lit by yellowish lamps. Each point of light represented a living crew and a decision he had helped make. The following hours felt like centuries. The radio transmitted truncated messages, confused reports, coordinates blinking like unstable stars. Then silence. And then confirmation. Peenemünde was in flames. The laboratory where German engineers worked had been destroyed. The attack cost 40 British aircraft, but the Reich's rocket program was paralyzed for months. When reports confirmed the deaths of key scientists, Jones understood the scale of what he had done. It wasn't just a military victory, it was the delay of a threat that could have changed the world's fate. Years later, it was discovered that Peenemünde also housed nuclear research. If it hadn't been hit, Hitler might have combined propulsion and fission. The war would have taken an apocalyptic turn. The irony was cruel. The same mad physicist, once ridiculed for believing in invisible beams, had ended up saving humanity from a radioactive future. And it all began with an antenna, a line of metal that dared to converse with the invisible. When the war finally ended, the world celebrated pilots, generals, and politicians, but almost no one heard the name Reginald Victor Jones. He walked the streets of London like an ordinary man, while his work remained buried under the seal of secrecy. The man who blinded the Luftwaffe vanished into the fog of his own history. No monument, no public medal, just silence, the same silence he had learned to master. He was only 33, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen what no one should. The war fought within frequencies, where truth and lies sounded the same. In 1946, the documents began to emerge slowly. American and Soviet scientists studied the British reports and, realizing the scope of what Jones had done, began calling him the father of electronic warfare. He didn't take pride in the title. He used to say, "I didn't defeat the enemy, I just made him miss." It was his subtle way of explaining that in the end, there's no glory in confusing the other, only the necessity of survival. When invited to teach at Aberdeen, Scotland, he accepted without hesitation. "I've fought enough with the invisible," he joked, with a tired half-smile. At the university, his students described him as a quiet but unsettling man. The classes were different. He didn't teach formulas, he taught seeing. He said every phenomenon, no matter how abstract, leaves traces. The impossible, he repeated, is just an incomplete equation. That phrase became a motto for an entire generation of engineers and physicists who would later see the birth of the space race and digital communications, direct fruits of the thinking he planted in the war's dark days. In the corridors of British intelligence, Jones's name still echoed in whispers. His method, detect, analyze, deceive, and win without being seen, became the foundation of modern warfare. Radar, sonar, cryptography, signal jamming, everything stemmed from the principle he proved in 1940, that the invisible space was the new battlefield. Even the Cold War was fought in part on the foundations he created. Spy satellites, scanning radars, beam-guided missiles, every innovation carried, in some way, the DNA of that old antenna hastily assembled in a freezing hangar. In 1997, at 86, Reginald Victor Jones passed away peacefully. British newspapers, now free from the secrecy that had silenced him, ran headlines, "The Man Who Blinded the Luftwaffe." It was the first time the public discovered the face behind the invisible victory. One reporter asked a former German pilot what he thought of the man who had sabotaged their instruments. The answer came like a perfect epitaph. "We thought we owned the sky, but there was someone in the shadows who understood it better than we did." Decades later, when new generations watch movies, series, and documentaries about World War II, few remember that the technological turning point began not in factories or trenches, but in a small office where a young man dared to believe he could see the invisible. He proved that human intelligence, when guided by purpose and courage, can be deadlier than any weapon, and that in the end, power lies not in the sound of bombs, but in the mind that can silence them. Reginald Jones never wielded a weapon, But he destroyed the most dangerous one of all, the certainty that the enemy always knows what it's doing. His antenna, simple and impossible, remains a silent symbol that war and life are decided by those who see what others cannot. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson left by that mad physicist who dared to converse with the air. Sometimes, to change the world's fate, you don't need to shout. You just need to listen to the invisible.